Images of mass destruction have been with us for as long as we can remember. In fact, they've been with us for as long as we've been able to imagine and we've been able to make images. Humans are unique among species in that we can both imagine and engineer our own mass destruction. Gorillas may fight and kill each other, but they can't wipe the whole of gorilladom off the face of the earth, nor can they imagine a world without gorillas. But since we can imagine it, and we can make it happen for real, we need to find some way of coming to terms with it. And that's what I want to explore today. So I'd like to start by asking you a question. Where were you when you realized just how easy it was for us to destroy ourselves and destroy each other? Many people here will be thinking about 9/11, I think, and other people will be thinking about the recent discussion about climate change and how that's made us realize just how precarious our existence really is. But I'd like to ask you another question. How did you come to that realization? I bet money on it being some kind of media-related experience, whether a fictional film, a news broadcast, or something else. And for me, it's something that happened back in 1986 when I was 5 years old. Now, this is me back then. As you can tell from my Space Invaders shirt, I loved anything to do with outer space. I talked constantly about aliens and spaceships, and I pestered my parents about wanting to become an astronaut. So imagine my face when, on January 28th of that year, I sat down to watch the children's programs on the BBC. After the cartoons and the competitions, there was always a child-oriented news broadcast called Newsround. And Newsround's top story that day was NASA's launch of their space shuttle Challenger. But the Challenger broke apart just over a minute into its flight, killing all 7 occupants. You can search for this on YouTube and see a clip of when this was shown on Children's BBC. You can see the continuity announcer here flinch as he looks into the monitor and realizes the story that Newsround are leading with. Now, I was just a bystander. Of course, it was nothing compared to the people who actually had to deal with this tragedy. But how did I cope with what I saw, apart from making some rapid career plans? How did I cope with it? Well, by developing a fascination with disasters and a fascination with media. And one of the first disaster-related media products I knew I wanted to study was the 1979 film Stalker. Though I didn't know it at the time, it was also in 1986 that the great Russian film director Andrei Tarkovsky died of cancer. And the most likely cause of the cancer that killed him was the toxic waste that he waded through while trying to get the perfect shot for this film. The film deals with the aftermath of a mysterious disaster that just happens, that nobody can really understand, that might even be extraterrestrial in nature. And the military come and cordon off the area where this disaster happened, securing it heavily. And soon after that, the profession of stalkers develops. Stalkers are people who sneak back into the zone through the cordon. And what happens when you get there? Well, you might be killed or you might be transfigured, getting your heart's desire from the strange powers that lie within the zone. Tarkovsky set this film in a world largely devoid of specific details of time and place, because I think he wanted to suggest that these kind of disasters could happen at any time to any of us. But he also wanted to suggest that with hope, we can live through it. And that was his way of dealing with what he was preoccupied with and with what he believed was to come. A real disaster happened. The meltdown of the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl in Soviet Ukraine. The meltdown caused a mass evacuation and the imposition of a 30-kilometer exclusion zone. And the cleanup of this disaster is predicted to last until 2065. And that's at the very earliest. Now, in the aftermath of this disaster, people started to make strange links between the fact and the fiction. They saw Tarkovsky's film as an eerie prediction of what happened that day. And gradually, as people began to go back into the exclusion zone, sometimes looting, sometimes taking tourists, sometimes just exploring, those people became known as stalkers. Now, strange things happen in the world of popular culture. It seems unthinkable that someone would take Tarkovsky's film, one of the most thought-provoking films, but also one of the most slow-moving feature films ever made, and combine it with details of the real Chernobyl disaster to make a computer game series. But they did. The game series, also called Stalker, ditches the high art aspirations of the film and instead adds elements from science fiction, fantasy, and horror. There are marauding mutants and an array of weaponry. I wonder if you feel it's a little disrespectful to turn a real-life, large-scale tragedy into a game with fantastical elements. Well, maybe, but these are Ukrainian game developers. They went back into the exclusion zone, they took photographs, scanned them, they took maps, and they fashioned their real-life national tragedy into something that was cathartic for them. That was their way of dealing with it. Then, in May 2019, media representations of Chernobyl went mainstream with the release of HBO's Chernobyl miniseries, which has been widely hyped as one of the best TV series ever. Now here there's a lot of attention to detail on architecture, on clothing, even on hairstyles. But on the other hand, real people are composited together to form fictional characters. And there's an emphasis on an unlikely trio of principled individuals taking on a corrupt establishment. "33 years after the fact, or so the program makers realized, an international audience would need an emotional buy-in. They'd want writers and directors to take them by the hand and make them feel emotionally what happened all those years ago. This was another way of dealing with it. So, as part of a project I'm working on with my co-researcher Melissa Beatty, I went to the Chernobyl exclusion zone myself. The whole place was full of tourists, of which I was one. Everybody was chatting with their guides, taking selfies. There's a souvenir stand with pop music blasting out. And this was in 2018, before the release of the HBO series. And later that day, after visiting the power plant itself, I found myself alone in a deserted school inside the exclusion zone. I was surrounded by torn posters, dusty textbooks, and left behind toys. And I started to second guess myself. Why had I come here? What right had I to poke around in the ruins of someone else's tragedy? And there was nothing there. It was just an empty space. I must have been expecting some kind of epiphany, something like the strength of feeling I felt back on that day in 1986, but instead, I was just a tourist, like a visitor to Disneyland or Daejeon O-World. There was a sense of emptiness, a sense of not belonging there at all, but also, if I'm honest, there was a feeling of disappointment. I'd followed this disaster all my life, read everything I could about it, and I was finally there. But it was just an empty space. And what else could it be? I started to think about the kids in this school. They would have been roughly the same age as me. They might have seen the Challenger disaster themselves and imagined that their role in the disaster would only ever be that of a bystander. Now, bystanders to large-scale tragedies often feel helpless, just like I did on that day back in 1986. If we're lucky enough to have it, we can donate money. And if we're lucky enough to have time, we can volunteer that. But there's one small but crucial thing that we can all do. We can think carefully about the images of these disasters that we make and that we share, because we have a chance to impart a message of fatalism, or from the rubble and the wreckage, we can fashion images of hope. Thank you.